Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling some pretty big, kind of philosophical questions about American democracy. And the best part is this whole discussion is sparked by one of you, our awesome listeners.
Love that.
You know, you reached out to us with your unique perspective, especially as a long-term immigrant to the U.S., and you've been kind of wrestling with some potential paradoxes.
Paradoxes, yeah.
Yeah, specifically with how the First and Second Amendments actually play out in real life. So we're taking this as our mission. We're going to deep dive into these foundational elements of the U.S. Constitution.
Right, into those foundational elements.
Exactly. And, really try to unpack and try to understand all the complexities that you've kind of put your finger on.
Absolutely. We've got your personal observations, which are so valuable because, lived experience is really key here. And we're also going to be looking at the historical context, the core principles behind these amendments, and then, of course, the many different ways that people have interpreted the First and Second Amendments over time. It's a rich area to explore.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah.
And, listening to your thoughts, you've raised some seriously compelling points. For example, the idea that the First Amendment seems to protect, everything, even false speech. And then you've got the Second Amendment on the other side. That's guaranteeing the right to bear arms, which is a whole other can of worms. You also mention a lack of what felt like to you clear kind of societal guidelines for communication.
Like how we talk to each other.
Yeah. And to you, this sort of lack of guidelines, this lack of, framework almost, leads to just a lot of incivility. And then finally, you brought up this sense that sometimes really outward patriotic displays maybe don't line up with actual individual action.
Yeah, a disconnect. I totally see that.
Yeah. So before we even, try to get into any of those thorny issues, I think we have to go right to the source.
Right.
We need to talk about the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah. I mean, that's the foundation.
Right. Yeah.
That's the starting point. And it's incredibly important, not just in American history, but, globally.
Okay. So the Constitution, it's historically significant. But, in a nutshell, what makes it such a landmark for democracy?
So it really comes down to a few core ideas that are super important. First, you have popular sovereignty, right?
Yep.
We the people.
Yeah.
It means the government gets its power from the people.
From the governed.
Exactly. And it also lays out some very specific goals for what this government should be all about.
Yeah, and what are those key goals?
Well, you've got establishing justice.
Yeah.
Ensuring domestic tranquility.
So peace at home.
Exactly. Providing for the common defense. Promoting the general welfare, and of course, securing the blessings of liberty.
Liberty.
Big ones.
Yeah, big ones.
Big ones.
Okay, so those are the goals. But how is this whole thing structured to actually achieve those pretty lofty goals?
Well, what they did is they set up 3 distinct branches of government. The legislative, the one that makes the laws.
Right.
The executive, which carries out the laws, and the judicial.
Which interprets the law.
Exactly. And each branch is given its own specific powers.
Okay.
But even more importantly, there's a whole system of checks and balances built right in. So this way, no single branch can become too powerful.
It's like a safeguard.
It is. It's a safeguard. And of course, we absolutely cannot forget the Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights.
Yeah. First 10 amendments to the Constitution. These are absolutely crucial because they guarantee fundamental rights and freedoms to individuals.
Yeah.
And this includes, of course, the First and Second Amendments that we're talking about today.
Right.
The whole point is, to protect against the government overstepping its bounds.
Right, against potential tyranny.
Exactly.
Okay, so you've got those safeguards in place. You've got these different branches that all need to work together. And on top of that, this whole system operates under the rule of law.
Precisely.
Oh.
And that's a cornerstone of any functioning democracy. The rule of law means that everyone, even those in power, are accountable to the same set of laws.
Nobody is above the law.
Nobody is above the law.
Okay, so we've talked about the goals, we've talked about the structure, and now we've talked about the rule of law. So was the U.S. a perfect democracy, right from the start, right out of the gate?
That's a really good question, and it's a very complex one. The Constitution provided this amazing foundation. But I think it's fair to say that its initial form wasn't a perfect democracy.
What do you mean?
Well, the framers, those who wrote the Constitution, they were a bit wary of pure democracy. of giving the people direct control over everything.
Really? Why? Why were they wary of the people?
I think their thinking was that elected officials, people who were chosen to represent the broader population, could actually make better decisions in the long run.
Interesting.
That they could represent the broader interests more effectively.
Okay, so it's not that they didn't trust the people. They just thought that maybe there should be some people kind of a little bit removed from the direct passions of the electorate.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And also, let's not forget, at the time, voting rights were pretty limited.
Right.
Mainly to property-owning white men.
Right. Not exactly representative of the entire population.
Not at all. And then you also had these mechanisms in place that were specifically designed to kind of limit direct popular rule.
Okay, give me an example.
Okay, so think about the way senators were originally elected. They weren't directly elected by the people. They were chosen by state legislatures.
Oh, wow.
And then you have the Electoral College.
Yeah.
Which also kind of puts a layer between the popular vote and the actual election of the president.
So there were some concerns there about just, maybe too much direct democracy.
I think that's fair to say. And then, we also can't ignore the really big elephant in the room here, and that's slavery.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, this is a huge contradiction to those core ideals of liberty and equality that the Constitution is supposed to be all about.
Right, a huge contradiction.
But it's important to remember that, the Constitution it's changed over time.
It's a living document, as they say.
Exactly. And a lot of those changes have come through amendments. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, for example, those were all passed after the Civil War, and they, abolished slavery.
Right.
They guaranteed equal protection under the law, and they granted voting rights to African-American men.
Huge steps forward.
Huge steps. And then, of course, you have the 19th Amendment, which finally gave women the right to vote.
Right. So it's been a long journey.
Absolutely.
A very long journey. And it's a journey that's still ongoing.
It is. It always will be.
Okay, so that's a great overview of the Constitution as a whole and its kind of, origins and some of its problems.
Some of the complexities.
Yeah, some of the complexities. Now I really want to dive into the First Amendment. I think this is really at the heart of your questions.
About free speech.
Yeah, specifically about the seemingly unlimited protection of speech and how that, can lead to the spread of misinformation.
Right.
So I guess the first question is, what's the story behind the First Amendment? Like, how did it even come about?
Well, the colonists had some really negative experiences under British rule.
Right. And this is before America was even America.
Exactly. So, under British rule, they couldn't freely practice their religion. They couldn't speak their minds. They couldn't criticize the government. And they certainly couldn't publish whatever they wanted.
And, I mean, freedom of religion, that was a huge motivating factor, right? I mean, for a lot of those colonists to come to America in the first place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, many of them came here seeking religious freedom. So the idea of preventing the government from interfering in people's religious beliefs, that was, super, super important.
Right.
And that's why you have the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause in the First Amendment. Okay,
so break that down for us a little bit. What do those clauses actually mean?
Sure. The Establishment Clause prevents the government from establishing, an official religion.
Right, like a national religion.
Exactly, a national religion. And the Free Exercise Clause protects an individual's right to practice their own religion or to practice no religion at all.
Right. It's your choice.
Exactly. And, it's really interesting to think about this in the context of, James Madison.
Okay.
He was one of the key framers. He's often called the father of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a huge advocate for religious freedom.
Ah.
And he believed that the government just shouldn't have the power to force people to worship in a certain way.
It's really interesting to think about how these issues, these debates that they were having back then are still so relevant today.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't just about religion, was it?
No, not at all. Freedom of the press was another huge issue for the colonists.
Right.
Under British rule, they faced censorship all the time. The government was constantly trying to control what was being printed and published.
Right.
And a really famous case, the Zender trial in 1735, this really demonstrated how important freedom of the press was becoming to the colonists.
Okay, remind me about that case.
So John Peter Zenger, he was a publisher in New York, and he published articles that were critical of the colonial governor.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, not a good idea at the time. So he was arrested for libel. But get this. His lawyer argued that what Zenger had published was true, and therefore it couldn't be considered libel.
So even back then, truth was a defense against charges of libel or slander.
Exactly. And the jury actually agreed with the lawyer and acquitted Zenger. And this was a major victory for freedom of the press.
That's awesome.
It really was. It set a precedent for the idea that the press should be free to criticize the government without fear of reprisal.
Right.
But the First Amendment, it's not just about, freedom of religion and freedom of the press.
Right. It's got some other really important components, too.
It does. It does. It also protects the right to assemble peacefully.
So the right to protest.
Exactly. The right to protest, the right to hold public meetings, the right to gather with other people who share your views. And this, historically, this has been super important. I mean, think about the civil rights movement.
Right.
All those protests and marches.
Right.
The right to assemble was essential.
Right.
And then you also have the right to petition the government.
To ask the government to address your grievances.
Exactly. And this comes from, way back, the Magna Carta. And it basically means that you have the right to make your concerns known to the government.
Right. To try to change things that you think are wrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And these rights, they were seen as absolutely essential for a functioning democracy.
Yeah, you have to be able to hold power accountable.
Exactly. And it was the anti-federalists, those who were kind of skeptical of the new Constitution. They were the ones who really pushed for the inclusion of the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment.
Right, because they were worried that the federal government might become too powerful.
Exactly.
Okay, so at its core, the First Amendment is basically about allowing for an open exchange of ideas without government censorship.
That's the basic idea.
Okay.
And this includes not just spoken words,
right,
but also what's known as symbolic speech.
Okay, so explain that to me a little bit. What do you mean by symbolic speech?
So symbolic speech is, it's actions that are intended to express an idea.
Okay.
Like, for example, wearing an armband to protest a war.
Right.
Or burning a flag.
Right.
Those are all forms of expression that are protected by the First Amendment.
Interesting. So it's not just about what you say. It's about what you do and how that conveys a message.
Exactly. Exactly. And the Supreme Court has said that there needs to be uninhibited, robust, and wide-open debate on public issues.
Wide open.
Wide open.
Okay.
Meaning that even unpopular or offensive views,
right,
they have to be allowed in order for this whole system to work.
That's a pretty strong stance.
It is. And the idea is that this free exchange of ideas, even the ones that we don't like, even the ones that might offend us,
right,
ultimately strengthens public discourse and makes us all think harder.
Right.
And it helps to create a more informed public that can hold its government accountable.
Yeah, and the First Amendment doesn't just protect your right to speak. It also protects your right not to speak.
Exactly.
The government can't force you to say something that you don't believe in.
Exactly.
Or to endorse a particular ideology.
Exactly. And it's important to keep in mind, the First Amendment, it also protects freedom of the press, the right to assemble peacefully, and freedom of association.
Right. So your right to join groups.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a very broad protection.
It's a wide-ranging protection. Okay, so it's wide-ranging, but that doesn't mean that it's unlimited.
Right.
So where do we draw the line? Like, what are the limits on free speech?
So there are certain categories of speech that are not protected by the First Amendment. And these are categories that the Supreme Court has recognized over time, generally as ways to prevent direct harm or to maintain public order.
Okay, that makes sense.
So one of those categories is incitement to imminent lawless action.
Okay, break that one down for me.
Okay, so this means that, speech is not protected if it's intended to incite.
So to encourage.
And is likely to cause immediate illegal activity.
Okay, so it can't just be like, hey, I don't like this law, I think we should go break it.
Right. It has to be more specific than that.
Yep.
It has to be, a clear and present danger. Like, for example, if you were to stand up in a crowded theater and shout, "Fire!"
Right, when there's no fire.
Exactly. That could cause a panic, and people could get hurt.
Right.
So that would be an example of incitement.
Okay, so it has to be a really clear and present danger.
Exactly.
Okay. What else? What other kinds of speech are not protected?
Okay, so another category is true threats.
True threats.
Yeah. And these are statements where the speaker intends to commit violence against a specific person or group of people.
Okay, so this is a little bit different from incitement.
It is, because with incitement, you're talking about inciting imminent lawless action in general.
Right, but true threats are more targeted.
Exactly. It's a direct threat against an individual or a group.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then you have defamation.
Defamation.
Which is basically harming someone's reputation.
With false statements.
With false statements, exactly.
Yeah. And this is where things get a little tricky because there's this distinction between regular people and public figures.
Exactly. So for regular people, to prove defamation, they just have to show that the statement was false and that it caused them harm. But for public figures, like celebrities or politicians, they have to prove something called actual malice.
Okay, so what is actual malice? Like, what does that mean?
It's a higher standard.
Yeah.
It basically means that the person who made this statement knew that it was false.
They knew it was a lie.
They knew it was a lie, or they acted with reckless disregard for whether it was true or not.
Interesting.
So it's much harder for a public figure to win a defamation suit.
Okay.
And this higher standard is based on the idea that public figures have more access to the media.
Right.
And they can more easily defend themselves against false statements.
Okay. So incitement, true threats, and defamation. Those are 3 types of speech that are not protected by the First Amendment.
Exactly.
What else?
Okay. So we also have obscenity.
Right. Now that's a tricky one because what's considered obscene can vary so much from place to place and time to time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But there's a legal test that's used to determine whether something is obscene.
Okay, and what's that test?
It's called the Miller test.
The Miller test.
Yeah, from a case called Miller versus California back in 1973.
Okay.
And the Miller test, it has 3 parts. First, the average person, applying contemporary community standards, would find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to prurient interests.
Okay.
Second, the work depicts or describes, in a patently offensive way, sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law.
Okay.
And third, the work, taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
It is.
So it sounds like it's a pretty high bar for something to be considered legally obscene.
It is. And, it's important to note that this test has been criticized over the years.
Right.
Because it can be pretty subjective.
Right. Especially that first part. Because what's considered offensive in one community might not be considered offensive in another community.
Exactly.
Okay. So obscenity. That's number 4.
Yes.
Number 5.
Okay, so number 5 is fighting words.
Fighting words.
Yep.
Now, these are words that are likely to provoke a violent reaction.
Right.
Like.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court has said that fighting words are not protected by the First Amendment.
Okay.
Because they don't really contribute to any kind of meaningful dialogue or debate.
Right. It's just trying to start a fight.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then finally, we have speech that's integral to criminal conduct.
Speech that's integral to criminal conduct.
Yeah. So this means that, if you use words to commit a crime.
Okay.
Like, for example, if you threaten someone as part of a robbery.
Right.
Those words are not protected by the First Amendment.
Okay. So those words are considered part of the crime itself.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've got a pretty comprehensive list here of types of speech that are not protected. And I know that this whole idea of limits on free speech, it's a very complex and controversial issue.
It is.
And there are a lot of different opinions on it.
Absolutely.
But I think it's important for us to understand the basics.
Yeah.
So that we can have a more informed discussion about these really important issues.
I agree.
Okay, so we've talked about what kinds of speech are not protected.
Right.
Now let's go back to your question about lies and truth.
Right.
You raised this point that it seems odd that lies, that false statements, would be protected under the First Amendment.
Yeah, that's a very common reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's understandable. I mean, why would we protect something that's demonstrably false?
Exactly.
But the rationale behind this is based on a fear of government overreach.
Okay. So elaborate on that a little bit.
Okay, so the Supreme Court has been really hesitant, throughout history, to give the government too much power to decide what's true and what's not. Because the thinking is, if the government can too easily criminalize lies, then that power could be used to suppress dissenting opinions.
To suppress people who disagree with the government.
Exactly. So this protection of even false speech.
Right.
It's not about protecting the lies themselves. It's about safeguarding this really fundamental principle
Of free speech.
of free speech
Yeah.
and preventing the government from becoming too powerful.
Right.
And that's where this whole idea of the marketplace of ideas comes in.
The marketplace of ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, so explain that one to me.
Okay, so the marketplace of ideas, this is this theory that says, in an open and free exchange of ideas, truth will eventually win out.
Okay.
So even if there are lies and misinformation out there,
Right.
the best way to combat them is not to censor them,
Right.
but to counter them with more speech, with more truth, with more evidence, with more facts.
So it's like you let all the ideas out there, and then the good ideas, the truthful ideas will eventually, rise to the top.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like you let all the flowers bloom, and then the prettiest ones are the ones that people will want to pick.
That's a good analogy.
Okay.
And this idea was really articulated by Justice Marshall.
Who was Justice Marshall?
He was a Supreme Court justice.
Okay.
And he wrote in a very famous opinion that the government can't restrict expression just because of its message.
Right.
Or because of its content.
Okay.
So even if the government thinks that an idea is dangerous
Right.
or harmful,
Right.
it can't just ban it.
Okay, that makes sense. But it also seems kind of dangerous because, what about the idea that, unchecked falsehoods
Right.
can really undermine an informed democracy?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. And that's something that a lot of people are worried about today, especially with the rise of social media
Right.
and the spread of misinformation online.
Yeah.
So, the thinking is that in the past, maybe this marketplace of ideas,
Right.
maybe it worked better because there were fewer voices
Yeah.
and it was easier for people to sort out the truth from the lies.
Mm-hmm.
But now with so much information out there.
Right. And with the way that algorithms can amplify certain types of content,
Exactly.
it can be really hard to know what to trust.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, that's a huge challenge.
It is.
And it's something that we're all kind of grappling with right now.
We are.
Okay.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And that's it.
Wow.
On the surface, you think, okay, well, that seems pretty clear-cut.
Yeah, it does seem pretty straightforward.
But as your sources point out, the fact that there isn't a super specific definition of what speech actually means, well, that's where things get a little bit murky.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge area of debate, right?
Absolutely, yeah. A huge area of debate in how it's actually interpreted and applied.
So that's interesting.
And there's another important point here. The First Amendment mainly restricts what the government can do, right?
Okay, so you're saying it prevents the government from, censoring people, right?
Exactly. They can't control what people say.
Gotcha.
But it doesn't necessarily regulate what happens, between individuals.
Right, okay.
Or shield people from the consequences of, whatever they might say.
So it's like the government can't stop you from saying something unpopular, but you could still lose your job over it or get, canceled on Twitter or whatever.
Exactly, yeah. You might face a ton of backlash, lose friends, all sorts of stuff.
Wow.
The social consequences can be pretty significant.
And that kind of gets into some really, really tricky areas, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. It gets really complicated. Or a redress of grievances.
Yeah, it's interesting. The wording is so straightforward.
Right.
But when you start to think about how it actually plays out in the world,
Yeah.
it gets kind of complicated.
It does. It does.
And, one of the first things that your sources kind of point to is this idea that, okay, the First Amendment says, the government can't censor us.
Right.
But it doesn't really define what speech actually is.
Yeah, that's where all the debate comes in.
Right.
Where do you draw the line?
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting. And so, you can be free from the government telling you what to say, but the Constitution doesn't really protect you from the consequences of what you say.
Right.
If you say something.
In your personal life.
Yeah.
In your job, among your friends.
Right, exactly. There can be, social fallout.
Right.
And so, one of the examples that really jumped out from your sources is this idea of hate speech.
Hate speech?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have these groups that, espouse these really, sometimes harmful ideologies, and they'll often point to the First Amendment to defend their right to say these things.
Absolutely.
Even though, what they're saying might be super harmful to minority groups, across all ages and backgrounds.
It's a tough one because
It is.
the thinking behind free speech is that, the the way to combat bad speech is with more speech.
Right.
That truth will win out in a free exchange of ideas.
Yeah, it's like the marketplace of ideas concept.
Exactly.
But then your sources bring up this point that it's like, the marketplace of ideas doesn't always work perfectly.
Yeah, it assumes everyone has equal footing.
Yeah.
And that's not really the reality.
Right. And some people have, louder voices than others.
Way louder.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so, that's kind of a nuance to that's important to think about.
It really is.
Okay, so another one that came up in your sources is like the whole issue of disinformation.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly online. And it's like how, these false narratives can spread so quickly and so widely.
Easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, they can influence public opinion.
And they can affect elections. They can target specific communities.
Absolutely.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal, and it affects, it's not just a small group of people. This affects a lot of us.
It affects all of us.
Yeah.
To some degree.
Especially during elections.
Absolutely.
And so it's like, okay, on the one hand, somebody might have the right to share information even if it's not accurate.
Right. But then you have to think about like the responsibility part of it. Like if that inaccurate information is causing harm or eroding trust.
Then what do you do?
Yeah. Then where's the line?
Right.
Okay. So then another one that I thought was really interesting that you brought up is online bullying.
Oh, yeah.
So we have this, awesome ability now to express ourselves digitally.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
In so many ways.
But, it can be used in harmful ways.
Yeah, you can use that power for good or for bad.
Right, exactly. And so, you see people using it to harass or intimidate others.
That's so easy to do.
Yeah. And it can cause real emotional distress.
Real damage. Yeah.
Yeah, especially for, young people or people who are already, kind of vulnerable.
Right. Absolutely.
And so it's like another example of how, this freedom that we have.
Which is so important.
Yeah.
To protect.
It can also be used to hurt people.
To hurt people, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tough balance.
It is.
And even, in the world of business, like you think about false advertising.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, yeah, we have laws and regulations.
To an extent.
But companies still have a lot of leeway in how they present their products.
Absolutely.
And they can kind of, stretch the truth sometimes.
We can embellish a little
bit. And so, it's this other area where, you have this freedom of speech, but it can be used to mislead consumers.
Right. And it can have an impact on their decisions and on their lives.
Oh. Okay. So then you brought up this other really interesting point about like this relationship between lies and truth.
Oh, yeah.
And how, the Constitution often protects opinions.
Even if they're not true.
Even if they're not true.
Right.
And so it's like, the thinking is that, okay, you have open debate and truth will eventually emerge.
Like the cream will rise to the top.
Yeah, exactly. But like you were saying earlier...
It doesn't always work that way.
It doesn't always work that way because not everybody has, equal access to information.
Right. Some people have much bigger platforms. They can control the narrative.
And they can manipulate the information.
And they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They absolutely do.
Okay. So let's switch gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about another area where the Constitution is trying to like walk this tightrope.
Okay.
The Second Amendment.
The right to bear arms.
Yeah, the right to bear arms versus, public safety.
Yeah. Huge issue.
Huge issue.
Huge issue.
And so, everybody knows the Second Amendment.
A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
And it's so short, but like, it's so debated.
So much packed into that one sentence.
That's so much debate.
And, you have that first part about a well-regulated militia.
Right.
But then it also says the right of the people. And so the question is, like, how do those two things connect?
Is it only about militias?
Right.
Or is it an individual?
Yeah. And your sources really emphasize the historical context.
Yeah.
Back when this was written, there was no standing army.
Right.
So citizen militias were, like, essential.
For the defense of the new nation.
Yeah, they were the defense.
Yeah.
But of course, things have changed a lot since then.
A lot.
And your materials, lay out some of the really serious issues that we're facing now. The frequency of mass shootings in America.
That's heartbreaking.
It is, and it really points to how easy it is to get guns.
Access to firearms is definitely a factor.
As a factor, yeah. And this is something that affects, all of us.
That's a culture of fear.
It does. It creates fear.
Absolutely.
And so it's like, okay, how do we balance this individual right to own a gun with the need to keep everybody safe?
A very, very difficult question.
Yeah. And it's not just about mass shootings. Your sources also talk about how gun violence disproportionately affects
communities.
Yeah, marginalized communities.
Especially young men in cities.
Right, exactly. And, it's a complex problem.
Very complex.
With a lot of different roots, but the availability of guns just makes it worse.
Adds fuel to the fire.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, it's so easy for things to escalate.
In a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody might feel like they need to protect themselves, and then suddenly you have this act of violence.
With tragic consequences.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then the whole mental health piece of it.
Oh, that's another layer.
Yeah.
A whole other layer.
It's like, how do we balance individual liberties with the need to prevent harm?
And how do you identify who might be a risk?
Right. Yeah.
That's a really tough one.
It's a very, very tough one.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears again a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about this idea of hypocrisy. And, it's kind of a more abstract concept.
It is.
But it's really important. And, you brought this up in your notes, this idea of like the gap between, the ideals of American democracy and how it actually plays out.
Yeah, the ideal versus the reality.
Right. And so, you'll see people like talking about patriotism.
Waving the flag.
Yeah. But then they're not really engaged.
Not really living those
elements. Or they're not respectful of other people's opinions.
Right.
And so it's like, are we really living up to the values that we claim to have?
Good question.
Yeah. And, you brought up this point in your sources about how, like, the emphasis on individualism in America can sometimes be at odds with the common good.
It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
For sure.
And, one example of that is just like the political polarization that we see.
So much division.
Yeah, where, people are so entrenched in their own beliefs.
They can't even talk to each other.
Right. And then there's the issue of economic inequality.
Right.
We have this idea of the American dream. But the reality is that, a lot of people are struggling.
The gap between the rich and the poor is getting bigger.
Yeah. And then, we can't forget about the environment.
Right.
This focus on, consuming more and more stuff.
It's taking a toll.
It's taking a toll on the planet.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we're still dealing with the legacy of systemic racism.
Oh, yeah.
And other social injustices.
That's a huge one.
Which, completely contradicts the idea that everybody's equal.
Yeah, it undermines the whole foundation.
Yeah.
Of the country.
And, your sources also pointed out that even the idea of the American way means different things to different people.
It's a very subjective concept.
Yeah. So for some people, it's about, achieving the American dream.
Right.
Upward mobility.
The house, the white picket fence.
Yeah.
2.5 kids.
Yeah.
For other people, it's about, individual liberty.
Freedom.
Yeah. Self-reliance.
Not being told what to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Some people see it as, America being exceptional.
Better than everyone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, there's some people who might see it as like, just taking advantage of the system.
Looking out for number one.
Yeah. And so it's like, how do you even have a conversation?
Right.
About, what it means to be American?
I mean, everyone has a different definition.
Right? Everybody has a different definition.
Yeah. It leads to a lot of misunderstanding.
Yeah. And a lot of conflict.
Absolutely.
Okay. So then this leads us to this idea of constitutional manipulation.
Oh, yeah.
You know how the Constitution can be kind of twisted
to serve someone's agenda?
Yeah, to serve somebody's agenda. And, part of that is just because the language is so broad.
Yeah, it has to be to stand test of time.
Right.
But that also leaves it open to interpretation, which can be good or bad.
Right. It allows us to adapt, but it also allows for manipulation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, your materials gave some really specific examples of that.
Yeah, like gerrymandering. Drawing the voting districts to benefit a certain party.
To rig the system.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, and it's all justified through, specific interpretations of the Constitution.
Right, they're twisting the rules to fit their goals.
Exactly. And then, another example is the appointment of judges.
Oh.
Putting people in positions of power.
Who share their ideology.
Yeah, who will interpret the Constitution in a way that aligns with certain political goals.
And those judges can have a huge impact.
Yeah, long-lasting impact.
For decades.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, there's the whole issue of campaign finance.
Oh, yeah, the money in politics.
Yeah, the money in politics, it's like, does money equal influence?
It sure seems that way.
It really does.
A lot of the time.
Yeah, and so it's like, is that fair?
Is that really what the founders intended? When they were talking about representation?
Yeah, is that really democracy?
It's a good question.
It is.
Yeah.
And then, you also pointed out that this kind of manipulation doesn't just happen domestically. It happens in foreign policy, too.
Yeah.
The U.S. talks a big game about democracy.
Yeah, we're supposed to be the beacon of democracy.
Right, but then we do things that kind of contradict that.
Yeah.
We interfere in other countries' elections.
Or we support regimes that aren't exactly democratic.
Yeah, we've got a bit of a mixed record.
Yeah, and so it's like, is that really living up to our values?
It makes people question our motives.
For sure.
For sure.
Okay, so last but not least, let's talk about human nature.
Okay.
And, how that plays into all of this.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, the Constitution is a document designed to govern human beings.
Yeah.
And human beings are complicated. We have competing desires.
We want freedom, but we also need rules.
Right.
We want to be individuals, but we also have to live together.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the Constitution is trying to create a framework
for managing all of that.
Yeah, for navigating those competing forces.
The pushes and pulls.
Yeah, but ultimately it comes down to us.
We, the people.
Right. We have to uphold those values.
We have to participate.
We have to be informed.
We have to be informed.
Yeah.
And so, your sources talk about the importance of education.
Absolutely.
And civic engagement.
People need to understand how the system works.
Yeah. Otherwise, they're vulnerable to manipulation.
Exactly. They're easy targets for propaganda.
Yeah.
And misinformation.
And, we also have to keep evolving as a society.
We have to keep learning.
Yeah.
Keep growing.
Developing empathy and understanding.
For each other.
Yeah, for each other.
Yeah.
And that's not something that happens overnight.
It's a process.
It's a process.
Right.
Yeah, long process.
It's ongoing.
It is.
So, okay, to kind of wrap things up.
Yeah.
It's clear that the U.S. Constitution is this, incredible document.
It's a masterpiece.
It is a masterpiece.
In many ways.
But it's also a work in progress.
Always evolving.
Always evolving.
Yeah.
We talked about the First Amendment.
Right.
That balance between free speech and responsibility.
Tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Second Amendment.
Gun rights versus public safety.
Gun rights versus public safety.
Another tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how those ideals.
The American ideals.
Yeah, how they sometimes clash with reality.
The hypocrisy.
Yeah, the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And then how the Constitution can be manipulated.
By people in power.
By people in power, both here and, in our dealings with other countries.
Yeah.
Because in the end, a lot of what we've been talking about, it boils down to this tension between individual desires and the need for social cooperation.
Oh, totally. We all want what's best for ourselves, but we also have to live together.
Right. And the Constitution, in a way, it's an attempt to manage that tension.
We'll find some kind of balance.
It lays out a system of rights and responsibilities, but it can't enforce itself.
It relies on people actually following those rules.
It does. And I think the sources really emphasize this, that in the end, it's up to each of us as citizens to uphold these values.
To make the Constitution work.
And that's where education and civic engagement are so important. Because if people aren't informed, if they don't understand how the system works...
They're easily manipulated.
Exactly. And they can be taken advantage of.
Right. And that's how democracy breaks down.
And it's a continuous process, right?
It is, definitely.
We have to keep learning, keep talking to each other, keep working to bridge these divides.
It's not a one-time fix. It's ongoing.
So to kind of sum up our deep dive today, the U.S. Constitution.
It's a fascinating document.
It is, but it's also incredibly complex and even contradictory at times.
Yeah, it's definitely not perfect.
And this tension, between individual rights and the needs of society, that's at the heart of it.
I think that's what makes it so relevant, even today.
I agree. So the sources, they make it clear that a healthy democracy, it requires us to be engaged, to think critically, and to really commit to those ideals of justice and equality.
For everyone.
For everyone.
It's a tall order.
It is, but it's work that's worth doing.
I agree.
So here's something to think about as you go about your day. And this is something that we didn't touch on specifically, but it kind of builds on what we've been talking about.
Okay, what is it?
Think about all these tensions we've been exploring today.
Right.
Like the conflict between free speech and the spread of misinformation, or the debate over gun rights and public safety.
Yeah.
How are those playing out in the news right now, in the events that are shaping our world?
That's a good question.
And how does understanding the complexities of the Constitution, all the nuances, how does that change how you view those issues? Our listener sent in their perspective as a 50-year immigrant, and it's really interesting how they see this whole concept of America as a beacon of democracy.
Yeah.
Especially because they point out some potential contradictions,
right,
especially with the First and Second Amendment.
Interesting.
So right off the bat, they're kind of challenging this assumption that the U.S. is like the example of democracy, just because it has the Constitution. Is that really how it works in practice?
Yeah, because on paper it sounds good, but
right, exactly.
How does it actually play out?
And then they get into the First Amendment.
Okay.
Which is all about free speech and everything. But they bring up this point that it doesn't really define what truth is.
Right.
So, how do you navigate that when lies and truth are kind of treated the same?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And they talk about this potential for, vulgar anger and bullying being protected under free speech. It's almost like they're saying, we need some guidelines for how to talk to each other, you know?
I see what you mean.
Where's the line between saying whatever you want and actually having, a decent conversation?
Well, the First Amendment is all about protecting all those different viewpoints.
Right.
Even the ones that we don't like or that offend us.
Yeah.
And throughout history, when people have tried to legally define truth, it hasn't gone well.
Oh, really?
It often ends up silencing people who disagree.
Ah, I see.
So it's tough because we all want these nice civil discussions, but figuring out how to actually make that happen legally within the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Super complicated.
Yeah, it's like a total balancing act.
Totally.
And then the listener moves on to the Second Amendment.
Okay.
And their concern is that a lot of people who own guns don't really get the original intention behind it. The text they sent us doesn't really go into detail about what they think that intention is.
Right.
But they're basically worried that there's this disconnect between the right to own a gun and,
And the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Historically and within our society today.
Yeah.
And, the Second Amendment is probably one of the most debated parts of the Constitution.
Oh, for sure.
And it's super hard to balance that right to bear arms with keeping everyone safe nowadays.
It's true.
And everyone's got their own take on what it all means, so
exactly.
It just keeps the conversation going.
Yeah, and they bring up this other interesting point.
Okay.
It's not just about the laws themselves, but
right.
You see people being all patriotic, with their hand on their heart during the anthem, but then later they'll be totally disrespectful to other Americans.
Wow, yeah.
And they wonder if it's because maybe recent generations haven't had it as tough.
Interesting.
So they don't really grasp these inherent tensions in the Constitution.
I've never thought about it like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's if life's always been good, you don't really get why these principles are so important.
Yeah. You might take it for granted.
Exactly. And then they get into the whole American dream thing.
Okay.
And how some people see it as actually achieving something, while others see it as taking advantage of others.
Right.
Which brings us back to their main point.
Which is?
That Americans need to remember that our freedoms have limits.
Totally.
You can't just do whatever you want.
Yeah, your freedom can't mess with someone else's freedom.
Exactly. And that's the core of any democracy, isn't it?
It is.
Finding that sweet spot between what individuals want and what's good for everyone.
Absolutely. And the Constitution lays it all out there.
Right.
But it only works if people understand it.
Right.
And actually use their rights responsibly.
And think about how their actions affect others.
Exactly.
So this whole deep dive has really brought up some huge questions about how we see the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah.
Especially based on this listener's experience as an immigrant.
It's a unique perspective, for sure.
Their thoughts on the First and Second Amendment and just America's society in general.
Right.
It all comes back to this balancing act.
Between freedom and responsibility.
Exactly. So I guess the question for our listeners is this.
Okay.
Given everything we've talked about.
Yeah.
What do you think are those unspoken responsibilities that go along with the freedoms we have?
That's a good one.
Because a Constitution can give us these rights, but it's up to us to figure out how to live with them.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And we'll catch you next time.
This is DigitView.